Hey everyone, it's Alan Thornton, President and CEO of St. John's Community Services, and back for another episode of Advocates for All. Joining me today is Grant Ebbesmeyer. He is the Planning Director of the Shelby County Continuum of Care, which Grant and I were talking is a very long title, but they have a massive job, and so does Grant. So Grant, thank you for joining us today. I really appreciate you taking the time to do so.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm grateful for the opportunity.
And just so everyone knows, Grant and I were actually supposed to talk last week on the heels of National Hunger and Homelessness Awareness Week. And during the month of November, we've been really trying to highlight homeless services. You know, St. John's has been serving in homeless services for a couple of years now in Ithaca, New York, as well as we just launched a program called Oasis for homeless youth here in DC. Grant's been at this work a little longer than we have. You told me before that you've been involved in homeless services in some form or fashion for about 5 years. Can you give us a little bit of what that has looked like for you during that time?
Sure. Yeah. So I started out after graduating doing some more direct service work in property management, property development for an organization here in Memphis, and then doing more direct case management for another organization after that. I'd actually done an internship at Community Alliance for the Homeless, which is the organization I'm at now, back in college when I was an undergrad. So I was really grateful for the opportunity to return in a full-time fashion after getting some more of that direct service experience. I'm able to bring kind of everything back together to serve in this role.
Yeah, direct service is really eye-opening. I mean, you really get to understand firsthand some of the challenges that create situations where people end up experiencing homelessness. And you get to know the people, you get to hear their stories. I think it can really be eye-opening for people and soften hearts when you realize, man, there's just enormous challenges and adversity that some people are having to overcome and deal with in their life, often with not a lot of support.
Right.
And so I would think now you've gone to a completely different role. You're really at the system level as an administrator of the system. And for those of people that might be listening today that aren't as familiar with continuums of care, can you take a couple minutes and just explain what is a COC and what do they do?
Absolutely. Yeah. So the Continuum of Care program is the largest federal investment in homeless services across the country. And so it's administered by HUD, and it includes a strong kind of local planning component that we were talking about earlier. And so that's the role that kind of our organization and I play. And so HUD is broken up the United States into about 500 different continuums of care, or COCs, we frequently call them. And each COC is operated a little bit differently. So in some cities, it's operated at a local government level or through the city or county government. Here in Memphis, we're operated, our lead agency, which is Community Alliance for the Homeless. We are an independent nonprofit, and we serve as that lead agency to organize all of the work of the Continuum of Care. And the Continuum of Care for each community is tasked with a few different things, kind of just general planning and gaps analysis and needs of determining what the needs are in each community, doing what's called a point in time count annually, or the PIC count, to see each January how many individuals are staying in shelters or different transitional housing facilities and how many are staying in unsheltered positions currently. And then another big part, of course, is helping to allocate the funding that HUD gives out through the Continuum of Care program competition each year to different providers in the community that are operating housing programs. A big focus of the Continuum of Care program is moving people into permanent housing using housing first principles and that sort of thing to actually end their homelessness, not just provide services, which are obviously extremely important to help people survive, but how do we actually move them from being homeless to being housed again? And so that funding competition happens annually. There's kind of a local level and again, it operates a little bit differently in each community, but different agencies apply to either renew the funding that they're already receiving for different projects that they're operating, or apply for new funding. Sometimes HUD puts out bonus funding or those sorts of things for specific project areas. And so we help facilitate that process on a local level. We have a community group that then ranks all of those projects and reviews them and their past performance and that sort of thing, and then submits that to HUD, who makes the ultimate funding decisions. But it is a very hyper-local process in a lot of ways of determining all of the different needs of the community and gaps and that sort of thing as well.
Yeah, it definitely, it really creates opportunity for local communities to have a strong voice about where they feel the dollars should go to best meet those needs in their communities. So, and I think over the last few years, it's gotten more and more organized, and positions like yourselves have come into being, and that's a huge job, pulling it all together. Can you give a sense of, how big is Shelby County or Memphis, and what are you seeing in terms of your numbers relative to people that are experiencing homelessness?
Sure. So Shelby County, which includes Memphis, population right at 1 million. I mentioned earlier, we do the point in time count, which is required by HUD to be conducted each year in the last 10 days in January. So we're getting ready to gear up for our next one, which will be interesting during COVID times. But in our past one, we've identified about 1,000 individuals who meet HUD's definition of homelessness. So we know that the point in time count doesn't include every person who has housing instability or is homeless or maybe in precarious doubled up situations with family or friends or that sort of thing. HUD really focuses in on those who meet the definition of literal homelessness. So that's staying in an emergency shelter, transitional housing facility, or unsheltered on the streets. We identified about 100 in that unsheltered population count last January, and about 1,000 total that meet that definition of homelessness in our community. We have seen declines in about the past 6 or 7 years or so. So we think that what we're doing is working, really focusing in on that housing first model to get people moved into housing and exit homelessness. But as I mentioned, of course, COVID has changed a lot of things, and we definitely have had providers anecdotally reporting quite a bit higher numbers of service requests and need just overall. And so we're very interested to see what the numbers are going to be looking like this coming January for the count. We do expect an increase of some sort. I think it's kind of just a matter of what that increase looks like, right?
And so just to, again, help people understand, so the point in time count helps drive kind of, or define rather, the level of need and subsequent level of funding that your community might receive, and then that your continuum would manage. And so when you talk about, I think you mentioned earlier, you have about 7 million or so that comes in to the community, and then you've got how many funded agencies? Was it 11 or 12 that you said?
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. So you've got 11 or 12 funded agencies. And so when you talk about that you believe that a lot of what you're doing, like your focus is working, what are some of those projects or some of those agencies that are showing the way? Like what are their programs? How are they leveraging housing first and other services in order to get people off the street, out of homelessness, and into their own place?
Sure. So as I mentioned, all of those programs are following housing first principles, which I think is the most important thing. For those who aren't aware, housing first principles just come from the basis that people don't need to be ready for housing. They don't need to engage in services or sobriety or mental health treatment before getting housing, but rather kind of flipping that around and saying, get them into housing first and then offer these services. They're more likely to be successful. People are more likely to be engaged and willing to accept these services if they're not also trying to fight to survive, right, on the street. It's kind of a hierarchy of needs. It makes sense, really, if you think about it from that perspective. And so all of our programs have been doing that really intensely the past 6 or 7 years that we've seen those declines. So that's certainly been helpful. And then within that, so we have a couple of different kinds of programs primarily. So there's rapid rehousing programs, which are shorter time limited programs for those with a little bit lower needs that, maybe just need some help finding housing and then a few months of rental assistance to get them back on their feet, find employment, or get that Social Security application to finally go through and get approved for that income so that they're able to maintain their housing longer term. And then we also have permanent supportive housing, which is also very successful. We have a very high success rate with that. Over 95% of people that get placed into permanent supportive housing in our community can stay there long term. So that means they're into their homelessness, they're housed, they're remaining housed, they're getting the services that they need. And then that permanent supportive housing, which is a little bit more intensive, is also not time limited. So they're able to stay in that housing. They have a lease like you or I, and so they are able to stay there as long as they choose to. Sometimes they might make some changes and then want to be reconnected with family in another city or even within the city. And so it's not, mandating that they stay there forever. Some people think that when we say permanent, but just permanent in the sense that they have this foundation and are able to continue as long as they choose.
Yeah, and I think your point is incredible. I mean, the hierarchy of needs. I've seen programs in the past, and I do believe that we have to have a lot of different solutions in order, and that not one size fits all. But I also have seen programs that focus so much on the behavioral component that they might be in that program for 2 years, and when they leave the program, they're not necessarily better equipped from a homelessness standpoint.
Right.
And so I think that it's great to hear that the projects that are being funded, the organizations that are being funded, have embraced housing first, because there's a lot of evidence. It's tried and true that if you can take away the crisis that people are experiencing, that and you can stabilize them, then they are much more open to receiving and asking and engaging in other services that will help them maintain that housing. So now that's great to hear. And it's got to feel good from a planning standpoint. You've worked in direct care, so you understand the plight of the people that are experiencing homelessness, but to be at the system level and seeing progress, and through concerted efforts and coordination, that has to feel good when you all come together to celebrate, because these aren't just numbers, these are people, ultimately, and it's people's lives and stories, and to know that you're helping their life be that much better and that much more stable, it's got to feel really, really good.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think we do get so focused on the numbers sometimes that we, especially at our systems level, that we don't always get those stories. And so that's something that also we've been encouraging our providers to do, is kind of share those success stories that they have amongst themselves and really celebrate those successes, because housing first, as you said, it's very evidence-based. We know that it works well, but that certainly doesn't mean that it's easy, right? It's actually extremely difficult to implement it and to implement it well. And so there's definitely some frustrations and growing pains and those sorts of things. But you're right, it's all comes down to the individual person and treating them with dignity and respect and getting them what they need to flourish and continue on.
Yeah, we've really enjoyed getting to know the community there. So the services that we primarily offer in Shelby County are for people that have intellectual and developmental disabilities. But as we've been growing our homeless services across the organization, we're trying to learn and understand what the community needs might be and whether or not we might be able to offer support, and lend a hand. So we've definitely enjoyed learning, that community and learning the efforts that are going on. A couple of our staff participate in the point in time count that you referenced, have attended a few different meetings. We've had an opportunity to present. And a lot of it is trying to understand what is happening already, and where you can potentially fit in, where there might still be a gap and you might be able to fit in and support. So I'm definitely curious to see where that goes, but I've really enjoyed the organization relationship that's forming and the understanding and knowledge that we're gaining as a result of it. So Grant, what do you hope for? Like, as you look at a change in administration, with that obviously can come different policy changes. That tends to happen whenever there's administrative changes.
Right.
What are some of the hopes you have looking out on the future? What are some of the concerns that you have looking out on the future?
Sure. So I guess I'll start with hopes. We'll start positive. I think I really hope to see an ongoing commitment to housing first, and ensuring that we're able to continue operating these programs as we have been and been successful doing in our community, and certainly countless others as well. So very hopeful for that. Hopeful for potentially some increased investment. Of course, I talked about, how much success we're having, but there's still 1,000 people that are homeless, right? And so we have to remain focused on that as well. And so we know that things are working, but we certainly don't have the scale yet of what we need to provide housing and those supportive services to those that need it. And so would be hopeful for some more increased investment nationwide that could, trickle down a bit here to our community, so we can continue bolstering and increasing and even further improving some of the programs that we already have. As far as concerns, of course, there's still so much uncertainty with COVID, especially in January or the end of December, really, as the eviction moratorium is set to expire. I think there's a lot of trepidation and fear and unknowns what's going to occur then. And not to say that certainly there haven't been any evictions up to this point, especially, more of the informal evictions and that sort of things. But once we kind of open those floodgates, so to speak, I think all of our providers are very concerned about what that is going to look like without increased investment on a very high level, both on the prevention side to keep people in their home, and then also for those that have already become homeless, how do we keep them safe during a pandemic with limited funding? So I'd say that's probably the greatest concern. And yeah, it'll be interesting to see how we're able to respond to that as a community, what kind of resources that will be given to help us do so in the coming months.
Yeah, I mean, you bring up a great point about the eviction moratorium and just what that could mean, that this that period of time, until there's a new administration, there's a great vulnerability. And then, I think we're assuming that the new administration would do something, but we don't know, and they're going to need time, so yeah, that could mean an increase in people out on the street, increase in homeless numbers. It could be an increasing demand on providers that are already spread thin. All of those things could happen, and unfortunately, like, just human tragedy in the midst of all of it. So, and especially at a time of year where, weather also plays another factor. And then you've got the risk generally of the pandemic that everybody's managing around and experiencing and impacted by. So yeah, those are all very, very real concerns. So how are you holding up, Grant? Like you've got a big job, which is challenging on a good day, and probably even more so in the midst of this past year with the pandemic, and just the initial impact it probably had on your providers, and looking at a fragile system and seeing it attacked by a pandemic, and just the concern about that. How have you managed to kind of take care of yourself during this time? What tips do you have for self-care? It's a question I've been posing to all of my guests, just to learn from each other as we go through this together.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Certainly something that we've been posing to our providers as well, to encourage them to be taking care of themselves. So I do really appreciate that. I'm still working at home, which I've actually found is something that I enjoy quite a bit. So that was a new thing that I've learned during this pandemic, and certainly have enjoyed, especially having my dog at home. I think that without him, I would be struggling quite a bit more, but he's a good excuse to kind of get out and get some fresh air and take a little walk and breathe and think about things, not staring at my screen trying to solve all of the problems. So yeah, certainly doing what I can to step away, knowing that there's a lot of work to be done. Of course, there's always going to be work to be done, but following that oxygen mask rule that we talk about with our providers sometimes as well, that if we're not taking care of ourselves, there's no way that we're going to be able to take care of this other huge need that's going to be there. And so, yeah, trying to just maintain remain conscious about all of that and doing what we can to keep moving forward.
No, that's great. The dog walking thing, especially, we have a couple dogs, and so I understand that, and they are a relief in many ways.
Absolutely.
They certainly bring a lot of enjoyment for sure. And I think your point on getting outside and taking a break from the screen is huge, because I think we can all get very zoomed out. We can all get caught up in emails. I've also found too that people are more accessible at various hours, which is both good, but also at the same time, there's, people have to have some boundaries in place in order just to come down and be able to regroup for the next day. So totally with you on that. Well, Grant, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to talk, and for giving us a little insight into Shelby County and what you're experiencing there. Congratulations on the progress that you've made, and we'll keep pulling for you that it continues. But really appreciate all that you're doing. All that you've done both personally at the direct care level, but now helping to manage a system as effectively as possible that really impacts hundreds and thousands of people over time. So thank you for advocating at that level, and thank you just for being in that fight and trying to win it. So thank you so very much.
Yep, thanks for having me.